The 2020 NFL Draft was one of the best we have seen in years, from superstar quarterbacks to one of the best receivers in the NFL, great offensive linemen, and players that were really, really talented that got drafted on day 3. It was a very impressive draft class. Today we are going to be looking 3 years later at a redraft and see where these players would go now today. Starting with the Cincinnati Bengals, I think they very clearly stick with Joe Burrow. While there's other talented quarterbacks, Justin Herbert, Jalen Hurts, Burrow's gotten them to a Super Bowl. He's completely changed the culture around the entire organization. And I think it's pretty clear that it has worked with Joe Burrow in Cincinnati, and I do think they would absolutely make that pick again. I think he's the second best quarterback in the NFL right now, behind only Patrick Mahomes. So I absolutely think that Joe Burrow would be the first overall pick in a redraft here. The Commanders up at number 2, they selected Chase Young out of Ohio State. He really hasn't been able to stay healthy, and when he has been out there, he's been good, but he's definitely not worth a top 2 pick. I think it's very clearly got to be a quarterback, and I think it's going to be Justin Herbert here. I know that Jalen Hurts has had some of the more team success, but I think Herbert right now has shown a lot as an individual passer. He's very, very productive. I think with a better offensive coordinator now this year, he's going to put up fantastic numbers. I think that would fit a little bit more what the Commanders like. It's kind of hard to disassociate what Jalen Hurts is outside of that really, really talented roster in Philadelphia. You know that Justin Herbert is a very, very good quarterback. He's going to be the number 2 overall pick. For the Lions up at number 3, Jeff Okudah just hasn't worked out. He's no longer on the team. He's ultimately in Atlanta now at this point. I do think that the Lions would take a quarterback. They would still have Matthew Stafford here, but Jalen Hurts would be too good to pass up at this point. And number 3 overall, the first 3 picks, not surprisingly, are quarterbacks. All 3 of these guys are top 10 quarterbacks in the league. They're top 6 or 7 quarterbacks, really. And so those type of players are going to go early in this redraft. And I think it makes a ton of sense for the Lions to take Jalen Hurts out of Oklahoma. He's been better every single year that he's played. He's one of the better running quarterbacks in the NFL and absolutely would be a top 3 pick in this redraft here. At number 4, I'm going to go with the first non-quarterback, and that absolutely has to be Justin Jefferson. I think he's the best receiver in the NFL right now. If it's not him, he is absolutely up there with the best of them. And I think for a Giants team that has had some decent receivers, but ever since Odell Beckham left, they really haven't had that star. I think Jefferson would absolutely be that. He is an easy selection for the first non-quarterback off the board. At number 5, the Dolphins up next. This is where things get very interesting. Obviously, Tua Tagovailoa, their pick previously in the actual 2020 draft, is still available, but I do think they go with another route. I'm going to go with Tristan Wirfs out of Iowa. I think Tua is a good player, but just with some of the injury concerns, there's just some inconsistency. How much is he a system quarterback versus really kind of elevating the talent around him? I think that's up for debate. Tristan Wirfs is a top 5 tackle in the NFL. He's still young. He's been immensely talented. He's moving over to the left side this year. I think he absolutely could play on either side. Tackle was a huge need for the Dolphins at this point. They didn't have Teron Armstead. Some of the guys they drafted, Austin Jackson in the real 2020 draft, really didn't work out. So Wirfs makes a ton of sense. You could argue with Tua, absolutely, but I think Wirfs is the better player, so I am going to go with him here. And then at number 6, once again, the Chargers needed a quarterback. They took Justin Herbert, but I'm going to go with Andrew Thomas. He has developed into one of the best tackles in the NFL as well. No Rashawn Slater at this point for the Chargers. I think you absolutely have a need at that tackle position. Obviously, you could go with quarterback, but I do think that it would make a lot of sense to get Andrew Thomas, who is one of the best left tackles in the NFL. This tackle class was really, really good, and it's headlined by Wirfs and Thomas. Both of them fantastic young tackles, and I think they would both go very high in this redraft. For the Carolina Panthers up next, picking at number 7, they went with Derek Brown out of Auburn. I think that he has been a quality player, maybe a top 10 pick, but I do think they would go in a different direction. I'm going to go with CeeDee Lamb, the wide receiver from Oklahoma. He has really developed into a true alpha number 1 wide receiver. He's a fringe top 10 receiver in the NFL. And, for the Panthers, who had DJ Moore at this time, but still needed some other playmakers, they desperately wanted to find that wide receiver too. They ended up taking Terrace Marshall a few years later. They've kind of looked to find that wide receiver too. Obviously now DJ Moore is gone, but CeeDee Lamb could have been that dominant number 1 wide receiver for them. And while Derek Brown has been a pretty good player for the Panthers, I do think CeeDee Lamb would have a bigger impact on team success, and that is is why he would be their pick at number 7. At number 8, the Arizona Cardinals selected Isaiah Simmons in the real 2020 draft. That absolutely would not be their pick here today. He really just hasn't turned into the player that they hoped he could be. I'm going to go with a corner, A.J. Terrell out of Clemson. 2 years ago, Terrell was the best corner in the NFL. He's so good when it comes to man-to-man coverage. I think he's shown some good things in zone as well. Had a little bit more of a down year last year, but he has shown that he is definitely one of the better young corners in the league. This Cardinals team really hasn't had a good corner since Patrick Peterson has left and, was no longer in his prime. So Terrell could absolutely be that kind of player for him. And I think for the Cardinals, that would be a very important pick and a much, much better selection than Isaiah Simmons in 2020. Next, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars. They selected C.J. Henderson, which was an absolute train wreck of a pick. Really hasn't stuck at all on any NFL roster. He's currently, no longer on the Jaguars. That happened pretty quickly, so they would certainly go in another direction. I'm going to go with T. Higgins, the wide receiver from Clemson. I think he is one of, if not the best, wide receiver 2s in the NFL. Really would be a wide receiver 1 on almost probably half the teams in the league. I think that for a Jaguars team that, now they have Calvin Ridley and they have some playmakers, but they've struggled to find that wide receiver 1. I think T. Higgins could definitely be that kind of player for them. He's huge. He might be the best contested catch wide receiver in the NFL right now, and I think that would be a massive improvement, obviously, over C.J. Henderson. Next, we have the Cleveland Browns up next. They had Jedrick Wills as their pick in 2020. I do think they'd go in a different direction. Wills has been all right, but I'm going to go with a division rival, somebody that was taken in the 3rd round, Alex Highsmith from Charlotte. He had a breakout season in 2022 for the Steelers. When Watt was injured, he really stepped up, had 14.5 sacks, and has really turned into a very, very complete pass rusher in the NFL. I think he has the potential to be one of the better edge rushers in the league. And for the Browns, you obviously have Myles Garrett, but Jadeveon Clowney really hasn't been a great edge 2 for them for a long time. Alex Highsmith would be a force to be reckoned with. Having him and Myles Garrett, much like the Steelers have him and TJ Watt, is almost unfair for opposing offensive line. So I think this pick makes a lot of sense for the Browns. Next, we have the New York Jets on the clock. They selected Mekhi Becton, who has just dealt with so many injuries. I think that they would go with Tua at this point. They have had poor quarterback play for a very long time. Zach Wilson was selected just 1 year after this, so obviously they were looking to upgrade this position. I think Tua has proven to be a pretty solid starting quarterback. It's just about the injuries and the scheme. How scheme dependent is he? But I definitely think he deserves to be, a top 10 or 12 pick in the redraft here at the Jets. Makes a ton of sense for him to land. At number 12, Henry Ruggs was the selection for the Raiders. They would very, very, very clearly not make that pick again. No longer in the NFL. Currently facing some big legal issues as well. They certainly would not go in that direction again. I think they'd go with Trayvon Diggs, the corner from Alabama. There's a lot to say about Trayvon Diggs when it comes to his playmaking ability. It is truly impressive how good he is at attacking the ball, coming down with interceptions, forcing turnovers, and I think it is very often understated how valuable that is. Now, he is over-aggressive. He does give up yards, especially on double moves and things that, he really shouldn't do on a consistent basis. That's why I don't know that he is necessarily a top 10 corner in the NFL, but his playmaking ability is absolutely crucial to this Cowboys defense, and I think for the Raiders it would make a lot of sense. They really just don't have much on the back end of that defense. Trayvon Diggs would be a huge upgrade over what they have and would be a playmaker on that defensive side of the ball that they desperately need. Next, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I think they probably go with just the best available player at this point. That would be Derrick Brown. Thought he's shown some really nice things, especially as a run-stuffing nose tackle. I think it's hard to kind of get a ton of recognition for that role, but I think he has been a very good player at that there. Obviously, they have Vita Vea, so getting Derrick Brown and Vea together would be just an insane run defense, and it would make them almost impossible to run on. Tristan Wirfs no longer available for them, so I think it just makes loads of sense for them to go in this direction. Next, for the 49ers, they took Javon Kinlaw. I do not believe they would do so again. I don't think he's been worth a top 15 selection by any means. They're going to go with Antoine Winfield, the safety out of Minnesota. He's been a very, very good pick for the Buccaneers. 49ers and somebody that has been very crucial to their defense, especially when they won the Super Bowl. He's a playmaker on that back end. He can wear a lot of different hats on defense. He's a good coverage player. He can come up and hit as well. Coming out of Minnesota, he was definitely a very good pick for them in the second round as he goes off the board to the 49ers at pick number 14. At number 15, the Denver Broncos. They took Jerry Jeudy early on. I don't think they would do that again. I'm going to go with Jonathan Taylor, the running back from Wisconsin. People probably would have freaked out and maybe still would freak out about taking a running back in the top 15 picks. But I just think he is worth it. He is one of the best young running backs in the NFL, just 2 years removed from being the best running back in the league. So I don't think it's bold at all to just take the talent, just be a good offense through Jonathan Taylor, and I think the Broncos would absolutely take that over Jerry Jeudy, who's been a fine wide receiver, but he's been on the trade block. I don't think the Broncos would necessarily take him again, and Jonathan Taylor is the best, most talented player available. For the Falcons up next, obviously can't take A.J. Terrell again, so we are going to go with Chase Young. He's obviously got tons of upside. He was the number 2 overall pick for a reason. The physical traits are absolutely off the charts. He just needs to stay healthy and become a little bit more focused on the techniques of playing the position. At Ohio State, he won solely because he was so physically dominant, and that has carried over to an extent at the NFL, but he hasn't really been able to turn into that superstar rusher that a lot of people, including myself, thought he would be. I do think that, at pick 16, he would be worthwhile. Take a swing at the talent. When he's been out there, he showed some nice things. He's just got to be a little bit more consistent, and, I do think he is still worth a top 20 pick in this redraft. For the Dallas Cowboys up next, can't get CeeDee Lamb again, but we're going to go with Brandon Ayuk, the wide receiver from Arizona State. The 49ers took him later in the first round here during the real 2020 NFL draft, and I think Ayuk would be a great selection for them. He's one of the better wide receiver 2s in the NFL. He's a top 5 wide receiver 2, and I definitely think that his route running, his speed, he's shown some really, really nice things for the 49ers. And for a Cowboys team that ultimately, misses out on CeeDee Lamb, getting him again in this redraft, I think Ayuk makes a lot of sense. Fills a lot of the same roles. He isn't quite as good, but I definitely think he is still a very worthwhile top 20 selection in this redraft and would be a very nice consolation prize. For the Dolphins up next, they took Austin Jackson. That was a very bad pick. I think he's been one of the worst starting tackles in the league. They are going to go with a 6th round pick originally for the New England Patriots, Michael Onwenu. He has been a fantastic player for the Patriots, well above that 6th round selection, and I definitely think that he would be a first rounder in this redraft. It's a little bit hard to place him because he is a guard. There is some limited value at that position, but I think for a team that was clearly looking to upgrade the offensive line, I think Onwenu would make a lot of sense. You get Wirfs, Onwenu, all of a sudden that offensive line is a strength for this team, and I definitely think it makes a ton of sense for them to go in that direction. Now we have the Raiders at number 19. They selected Damon Arnett. Once again, just a terrible selection for them. I'm going to go in a different direction here and to have them select Josh Uche out of Michigan. He has been another fantastic selection for the Patriots. He wasn't a day 1 pick, he was a day 2 pick, and has really outperformed that very well. He's been a very nice young pass rusher for them, and for a Raiders team that desperately needed some help at that pass rush spot, they really needed some defensive help. Getting Uche as well as Trayvon Diggs in this redraft would be huge for them, would really add some playmaking ability and some real talent to that defense that they desperately need. Next, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars. They took K'Lavon Chaisson. Very poor selection for them. We're going to go with corner, not C.J. Henderson, who they took. We are going to go with L'Jarius Sneed, who was a pick for the Kansas City Chiefs in the 4th round. Sneed has well outperformed that, was really good early on in his career and has only gotten better. He's the Chiefs' number 1 corner, and I think he has definitely been a very talented player that he would certainly go earlier than he was selected in the real draft for sure. I think Chaisson has been a complete disaster for the Jaguars, and Sneed would be a great pick for them to really kind of solidify that defense. Next, we have the Philadelphia Eagles. I am pretty confident they would not select Jalen Reagor again. I'm going to go with Jedrick Wills from Alabama. Like we said for the Browns, he's been a perfectly average tackle. I still think that average tackles would go in the first round. He definitely hasn't been a complete liability for a team that absolutely loves drafting offensive linemen. The Eagles definitely would be intrigued, I think, with Wills. Maybe they could kick him inside. Maybe they would be able to coach him up a little bit better because the Eagles really just do that on a very consistent basis, and I think that he would be a very good selection for them. The Vikings were always going to be the biggest losers of this. They no longer get Justin Jefferson. I will have them going with Michael Pittman, though. He is a decent consolation prize, has been a solid wide receiver for the Indianapolis Colts. I do think he is the best receiver available here. Judy is all right, but I do like Pittman a little bit better. I think he has shown some nice things as a jump ball receiver. He can be kind of more of that true X receiver as well. You're not going to get Justin Jefferson this late in a redraft, so Pittman is a decent consolation prize, though he is only probably going to give you 50% of what Justin Jefferson is. Next, we have the Chargers up next. I'm going to go with Kyle Duggar out of Lenore-Ryan. He has definitely been another steal for the Patriots in this draft class. They had a very, very good draft class, and I think it's been proven by Duggar, Uche, as well as Onwenu coming off the board here. I think for Duggar, he has shown some really good versatility, both as a linebacker, as a safety. He can kind of play all over that back end of the defense. And for this Chargers team, they ultimately took Kenneth Murray, who really hasn't panned out being worthwhile a first-round pick. I think Duggar makes a lot of sense. Him and Derwin James would be such a versatile, fun duo on the back end of that defense and would make a lot of sense to pair them together. Next, we have the New Orleans Saints. They selected Cesar Ruiz, who has slowly kind of become a solid offensive lineman, but I do think they would go in a different direction, even though he is still on the board. I'd go with Jerry Jeudy. I think that he's been a solid wide receiver too. For the Saints team, no Michael Thomas really on a consistent basis ever since this season. So I think it makes a lot of sense to get a reliable wide receiver to kind of put in that room. Eventually would maybe be able to pair him and Chris Olave together and have a solid duo there. But I do think that this is a little bit more appropriate for where Jerry Jeudy should have gone. Next, we have the San Francisco 49ers. I'm going to go with Jonah Jackson from Ohio State. I think he's a very underrated player in this league. He was a Pro Bowler just a few years ago. I think he would be very, very good in that Shanahan system as well. He's been an above-average starting guard for the Lions for a few seasons now, and I think the 49ers would absolutely value that. And although it might not be the most valuable position, I definitely think he is one of the more talented players still left on the board, so I think it makes a lot of sense for Jonah Jackson to go to the 49ers there. Next, we have the Green Bay Packers. You could certainly make the argument that they would go with Jordan Love. It all just depends on how he plays this year. It's really kind of tough to make that argument without seeing any kind of consistent play from him. So we are going to go in a different direction. Go ahead and go get Aaron Rodgers, instead a target, and that's going to be Darnell Mooney, who the Bears snagged in the 5th round of this 2020 draft. Was a great selection for them, has turned into a very reliable wide receiver too, and I think for the Packers, Rodgers definitely could have used that Adams and Mooney, and that might have been enough to get them over that hump with Rodgers at quarterback, finally get him a reliable wide receiver too outside of Devontae Adams. Now we have the Seahawks. I'm going to select another Chicago Bears pick, actually. It's going to be Jalen Johnson, the corner from Utah. Thought he's shown some really nice things. He's not necessarily a true number one alpha corner, but I definitely think that you could put him on the opposing team's best receiver and he will hold up fairly well. I think for the Seahawks team, obviously didn't have Tariq Woolen at this point. They needed some help on that back end. Jalen Johnson would have made a lot of sense for them. He is kind of a zone-heavy corner with the Seahawks running so much cover 3 with that Legion of Boom era and kind of afterwards as well, still the remnants of it. I think that Jalen Johnson would be a perfect fit in that system as well. Now we have the Baltimore Ravens. They originally took Patrick Queen. He's been a fine linebacker, but I think he's really only become maybe worth that selection since Roquan Smith has come there. I think they'd go in a different direction. It would be Jeremy Chin, who's kind of a safety defensive back linebacker hybrid. I do think that out of Southern Illinois, he was a very intriguing prospect. He's just kind of a playmaker. He does a little bit of everything, gets some sacks, gets some interceptions, forces some fumbles, is really solid in coverage. He's just kind of a Swiss Army knife on the back end of that defense. He would be Kyle Hamilton before, the Ravens have a chance to select Kyle Hamilton. So I think it makes a lot of sense for them to go there. Next, we have the Tennessee Titans. They would select almost anybody over Isaiah Wilson, who was just a terrible selection for them. I think they'd go with Robert Hunt, who has been a solid player for the Dolphins, starting at guard. He was a really solid selection for the Dolphins in the second round, and I do think that for a Titans team that was clearly looking to upgrade the offensive line, they could have gone with Hunt, and that could have been a nice selection. Really, any of these players that lasted more than 1 or 2 seasons in the NFL would have been a much better selection than Isaiah Wilson, so Hunt is going to be the pick there. Next, we have the Dolphins, and I am going to go with Jordan Love here. I can't walk away with this draft without a quarterback, so I think it makes a lot of sense. They only had Ryan Fitzpatrick and Josh Rosen on the roster at this point, so Jordan Love makes a lot of sense to go with here. I do think the Dolphins would be very happy with getting Tristan Wirfs and Michael Onwenu to upgrade the offensive line, and then getting Jordan Love, who still has a lot of potential and just needs to show it. I think that would be a much better draft for them than getting Austin Jackson, as well as Noah Igbenogany, who they selected 30th overall previously, so I'm going to go with Love there. Next, we have the Vikings. They selected Jeff Gladney, which obviously didn't work out, but I am going to go with Logan Wilson, the linebacker from Wyoming. I thought he's turned into a really good player for the Bengals. He's always around the ball, has come up with some really big interceptions, and I do think that he has turned into a definitely top 20 linebacker in the league. For this Vikings team, I definitely think that could provide a lot of value and that they would go in that direction there. And finally, going to go with the Chiefs. I'm going to have them selecting Gabe Davis out of UCF. Has become a kind of inconsistent wide receiver 2 for the Buffalo Bills, but I do think that his vertical ability with Patrick Mahomes would be truly impressive. That's going to do it for our 2020 NFL redraft here. Let me know how I did, who you would want your team to select. If you like this kind of content, please hit that subscribe button as well. It would truly mean a lot. I appreciate your support so much. Thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your day. I'll catch you in the next one.